And we are live. All right. So before we get going, did you guys have any specific questions or anything you wanted to go over on the quiz, the FAA quiz?
I went through it. I do have some questions, but I need to digest the information a little bit more so I can
Okay.
be in a position to learn. So I may hit you on Slack or via email or something.
That's fair. Yeah, there's that one trick question in there, which the FAA employs the method of choose the best answer, even if all three are correct. A lot of times, which is unfortunate, because there's a one trick question there about the heading indicator, which is a little difficult. There is one better answer, but all three I think are correct. So, yeah, if questions come up when you're doing it, you guys just hit me up. Alrighty. With that, let me share screen. We'll get rocking. All right. Let me know when you guys can see that.
That brings back childhood memories. The teeter-totter. I haven't been on one of those in a long time.
I know. We're gonna use that example all night here.
Oh my God, that's horrible.
Well, you guys better know how to use one because it's going to make it easier to understand the lesson. All right, Emily, I saw you join. Are you radar contact? All right, can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
All right, so weight and balance is the topic tonight. We're going to cover the methods that you're going to employ to calculate weight and balance. Most importantly, once you've got that nailed down, which I don't expect it to be experts at it after this evening, but after you've got the theory of it nailed down, understanding how it affects the aircraft in flight is extremely important. As we learned in the aerodynamics lesson, the aircraft is designed certain ways for stability and maneuverability, but the pilot in command can greatly affect that by which ways in which they load the aircraft. Even when the aircraft's loaded within allowable limits, you can greatly affect the way it's handled and how you fly it. So we're going to go over the way you do the calculations. So tonight is a little math intensive, so bear with me. And then also just some of the theory behind how you manage weight and balance in your flight planning. So probably the biggest high-level important item to remember when you're thinking about weight and balance is it greatly affects performance. It is probably the biggest aspect of your flight planning that will affect aircraft performance. The reason I say that is, your aircraft is designed one way, it has one engine in it, it's got one size fuel tank, so certain aspects of your flight planning are always going to be very similar from flight to flight. However, the way in which you load it, whether you've got one passenger, 4 passengers, a bunch of bags, or just a pilot, it can vary from flight to flight. That'll always change. So for each flight that you do and you do a weight and balance calculation, you will then be able to correlate that to a level of performance you can expect from the aircraft. It might be obvious, but the more the aircraft weighs, the worse it performs. So if you're operating your aircraft at its weight limit, you can expect worse performance out of the aircraft, including fuel burn, climb performance, cruise performance, than you would if your aircraft was hardly loaded or only had, say, one pilot in it. And it's important also to note that some pilots will operate their aircraft at the maximum weight. Some even will admit that they operate it outside of its limitations. And even though aircraft are designed with certain safety factors, operating the aircraft outside of its weight and balance limitations is just completely unproven engineering territory. The aircraft has not been tested at those limits. So, you know, some of the examples that you read, I've got a couple news articles we'll look at here at the end, where pilots are operating the aircraft hundreds of pounds overweight, and the aircraft still flies. So even though it is possible, it's not part of the aircraft certification process. So you can't be guaranteed that the aircraft's actually going to fly. Also, like I mentioned, even if you are operating within the weight and balance limitations, you have to consider forward versus aft loading scenarios. Even if you're completely within the limits, your aircraft will perform differently depending on if it's forward loaded or aft loaded. And so, yes, there's the seesaw. And we'll use the seesaw tonight to kind of ground us on some of the theory. But really, I think what's important, and maybe it's obvious, but you know, the guy appears to be heavier, the girl appears to be lighter, and so to balance the seesaw, the guy has to kind of sit closer to the fulcrum, right? And the girl has to sit further away. So that'll be kind of the foundation of weight and balance theory. Has a lot to do with weights, obviously. Also has a lot to do with distances from certain aspects of the airplane. So really, in its simplest form, weight and balance centers around the idea of a center of gravity. And what, so who can tell me what is a center of gravity?
Like a scientific definition?
To
me, it's where I'll define it in my layman's terms. It's sort of the point where from there weight is balanced in all angles.
Yeah, you could say that the entire weight of the object is concentrated on like a single point.
There you go.
Yeah, exactly. And in this diagram here at the top, you see the guy. I think this is actually, I think I Googled radio controlled aircraft. You see this person is balancing the aircraft on his finger, and it's balancing relatively well, straight and level, you know, flying forward. So the center of gravity, you could say, is around where that guy's fingertip is. In the bottom example, and I'm saying, you know, hey, maybe this individual put more bags in the aft cargo hold of the aircraft, but you can see the center of gravity is moving rearward, closer, you know, further back from where that guy's balancing. So if he wanted to get it back into the configuration that he's got in the top, he'd have to move his finger back. So center of gravity is a huge aspect in not only calculating weight and balance, but understanding how performance will be affected for your airplane. In these two examples, we are looking at longitudinal balance. If you remember back to the first lesson, you've got longitudinal stability. Well, this, depending on how you load your aircraft forward versus aft, will affect your longitudinal balance. And likewise, depending how your aircraft is loaded, I'll call it, you know, from a pilot's perspective, left versus right, will affect your lateral balance. Now, really, truthfully, in the kind of flying we will do, the only real way you're going to affect lateral balance is fuel. So most all aircraft store their fuel in wing tanks. And most aircraft, you can control which tank feeds the engine. So if you're flying along and you are burning fuel from one tank for hours and hours, ignoring the fact that you have fuel in another tank to burn, you could end up with a lateral instability because you've got more weight fuel in one wing versus the other. So in this example, you know, this pilot, even though this aircraft is not flying, there is a lateral instability due to 100 extra pounds of fuel in the left wing as opposed to the right wing. For weight and balance calculations, you will not typically you won't look at lateral weight and balance just because from a pilot's perspective, there's no significant way you can load the aircraft to affect this, except for the example I just gave, fuel burn. Everything from a weight and balance perspective, when you calculate for flight planning, will be longitudinal, forward versus aft. Now, if you've got like a wing walker or somebody who's going to, do some tricks, walk out to the edge of the wing, that's a different story. But fuel is really the only way that you're going to affect lateral balance. So like I said, we're going to get into some heavy math. And so before we do that, I want to clear some definitions. Some of this, depending on, what your educational background is, this may be, review for you. But it's important that we kind of understand some of the definitions and the foundations for the math equations that are around the corner, so that we can, when we're doing the equations, we kind of understand the physics that go behind it. So moment arm is the distance that a certain weight acts on an object from a defined datum. So for this particular aircraft, Boeing 737, the datum is defined as the nose of the airplane. And for weight and balance calculation purposes, the nose of the aircraft will be the point at which all weight inside the aircraft will be measured from. And now I've got the center of gravity, the CG, noted here on the screen. The moment arm for that particular CG location happens to be 60 feet from the nose of the aircraft. Now, if you took a bunch of sandbags and put them in the last seat of the aircraft, row 33, say, that moment arm for that weight that you load in the back seats would probably be around 120 feet. And in that case would affect the center of gravity, similar to what we saw in the example a few slides ago. So when you're doing weight and balance calculations, which we'll get into in a second, each weight that's considered, including pilots, bags, fuel, and other items in the aircraft, will all have a moment arm, which will be measured from a certain reference point, which we're going to call it a datum. There's also a series of definitions which the FAA wants its pilots to know as it relates to certain aircraft weights. I'm going to roll through them here. It's in practice, you're going to utilize a couple of these, and especially in your calculations, you'll use empty weights and gross weights and payloads. But let's roll through these real quick, and then you guys stop me if something doesn't make sense. And by the way, these weights are all certificated. So when you go into your aircraft handbook, your pilot's operating handbook, all of these weights can be found. And we're gonna, after I clear these definitions, we'll go over to a pilot's operating handbook, and we'll look at the different weights for the aircraft. So standard empty weight is the as delivered weight of the aircraft. So if you're going to purchase it and not to make any modifications to it, meaning you've purchased it from the factory, it's the as delivered weight of that aircraft plus any unusable fuel plus full oil. And this standard empty weight is typically what you will use on a new aircraft to calculate the empty weight of your airplane. The reason unusable fuel is included in the calculation is because that portion of the fuel tank that will never get burned will always be there. So it's always considered part of the empty weight of the aircraft. Basic empty weight, or sometimes called licensed empty weight, is what you typically will find on aircraft these days, because not a lot of us are buying new airplanes. It's the standard empty weight, which we just went over, plus other equipment. So You've got a 1980s Cessna, and obviously over the past 30 plus years, it's been modified. It's got new avionics. It may have new, may have new equipment on the airframe. And so each time the airplane goes through a modification, typically it's for avionics, but it can be for anything, it has to get reweighed. And let's just go to the POH really quick. So this is a pilot's operating handbook for a 1976 Piper Arrow. And let's just go and try to find the. So this is in the pilot's operating handbook, and essentially this aircraft went through a major avionics upgrade. You can see here in the list what was removed and what was installed. And then after all the work's done, the basic empty weight right up here in the top right of the screen was calculated. New basic empty weight, 1,753 pounds, 54 pounds. So each time the aircraft goes through a modification of any kind, it gets reweighed and is given a new basic empty weight. Okay, maximum landing weight. All of us single-engine aircraft pilots will likely never use this because our aircraft don't have this. But if you hear this lingo, it's the highest weight for which the aircraft is allowed to weigh for landing. Jet airliners have this. They oftentimes, if there's issues with a flight and they have to return or land early, they have to burn fuel or dump fuel. It's because of the max landing weight. Maximum ramp weight is the total weight of a loaded aircraft, including all fuel, prior to taxi. And it's higher than maximum gross weight, which we're going to go over here next. And it assumes that your ramp weight with a full aircraft, full gross weight plus fuel, is going to burn off a certain amount of fuel before it takes off. So when you're flying, and this typically affects commercial operations, but when you're flying on an airline flight, if the maximum gross weight of an aircraft is 10,000 pounds, the FAA will allow the aircraft to weigh, say, 10,600 pounds on the ramp, assuming it's going to burn that 600 pounds on its way to the runway for takeoff. Payload, weight of all occupants, cargo, and baggage. Useful load is the maximum gross weight minus the basic empty weight. So in other words, this is pretty much another way to say payload. It's the maximum weight that the aircraft can weigh for takeoff minus the standard empty weight plus optional equipment. So it's basically your pilot, co-pilot, passengers, bags, all usable fuel, and drainable oil. So if we go back to the operating handbook here, you can see that the person who weighed this aircraft did this calculation for us, knowing that the maximum gross weight of this aircraft is, it's actually up here, 2650. Knowing what the maximum gross weight is and the empty weight, the basic empty weight, you can calculate the useful load. So for this particular aircraft, it's about 896 pounds. So from a flight planning perspective, I know that with myself, any passengers, any bags, and fuel over and above the unusable fuel, I can load the aircraft up to 896 pounds. All right. Does that, before we leave there, does those definitions all make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, useful load is one, and I noticed I don't have maximum gross weight on here. I should have put that on here. But useful load is the one for flight planning purposes you'll always use. You'll for the aircraft that you fly, you'll know that like the back of your hand, so that as you're going to the airport, if you're doing a quick weight and balance calculation, if I know that 896 pounds is the number, I'm adding my weight, my passenger's weight, the bags, the fuel, and ensuring that I'm below 896 pounds. We talked on the second slide about center of gravity, and also about limits, performance limits on weight and balance. When we talk about the limitations from a weight and balance standpoint, we're primarily talking two particular parameters. The first one being the maximum weight, so the maximum gross weight, and the second one being the center of gravity range. So if we remember on the second slide, that individual trying to balance the aircraft on a single point on his finger, aircraft are certificated to have a center of gravity between 2 points, forward and aft points. In this particular example, you can't really see it, it's kind of blurry, but it's between 80 inches and 93 inches aft of the nose of the aircraft, which is the datum in this particular case. So when we're doing our weight and balance calculations and doing our math, if we have a center of gravity that's 79 or 94, we're technically outside the operating limitations of the aircraft. Likewise, if we have an aircraft in this particular example that's loaded above 2650, then we're outside of the operating limitations of the aircraft. And so this chart here you'll become extremely familiar with. It's the operating envelope for the weight and balance. When you do your calculation, you'll plot the maximum gross weight versus the center of gravity. And if you are if your point lands inside the operating envelope, you have a safe aircraft to fly from a weight and balance perspective. So center of gravity range is the forward and aft limits from a center of gravity standpoint. Okay, we talked moment arm before. We defined moment arm, and now we're gonna get into a little bit of math. So in this particular example, you've got the heavier individual over here, 200 pounds on one side of the seesaw, and you've got the lighter individual, 115 pounds on the other side. And it should be intuitively obvious why the heavier individual sits closer to the fulcrum, but can one of you guys tell me what would happen if the heavier individual started to move backwards, closer to the handles on the seesaw?
The female's moment arm would increase in length.
Well, so maybe I said that incorrectly. So the guy, the 200-pound guy, if his moment arm increases in length, what happens to the seesaw?
It will tilt down.
Yeah, exactly right. Similarly, if we start loading this guy up with pizza and he gains 10 pounds, what happens?
The female goes up.
Yeah, same thing. So from a physics perspective, increasing in weight or increasing in moment arm will cause the weight to shift, right? Will cause the seesaw to tilt one direction, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So when you consider that and go through a bunch of heavy calculus, you find out that the moment arm equals the weight, or I'm sorry, the moment equals the weight times the distance, or times the arm. And these actually have numbers. So if the arm for this guy was 10 inches, then the moment would be 2,000 inch-pounds. You would take the 200 times the 10 inches, 200 inch-pounds. Right now, since the seesaw is completely level and balanced, the moments on each side of the seesaw are equal. So since you know their weights, you could figure out what these individual distances are. So the moment force equals the weight or the force times the arm. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Emily and Alan, is that pretty clear?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, and so from there, you can take it just a step further, and along we'll just keep using the seesaw example. Along the seesaw, you can have several forces. You can have multiple people, or what have you, and it all can be summed up. So moment equals force times arm. Moment 1, moment 2, moment 3, moment 4, dot dot dot. On and on, and you can add up these total moments and these total forces to find out where your center of gravity is. Because as we showed, let me go back to this slide. Right here, even the center of gravity, where all the forces are considered to be acting on one point, has its own arm, has its own moment arm. So when we consider a seesaw that has several forces acting on it, we can add up all the weights, all the forces, all the moments, and then divide them to find out a center of gravity arm. So, hard to tell from this picture, but if all these forces were equal, you might say that this would balance out because of this force way out here to the left might balance everything out. But if you know all this information, if you know the weights and the distances, or the arm, you can find the center of gravity for this scenario. And that's how we're going to do it for an airplane. There are there's two ways that the FAA will expect you to show your understanding of weight and balance. One will be, and it's kind of the reason I'm showing a bunch of seesaws. One will be explaining the math or showing the math on balancing a seesaw like this. The written test will have examples like, you're given this example here, find the distance, find the 100-inch distance, or how much weight has to be 100 inches away to balance the seesaw. And then the second way that they'll expect you to understand it, of course, is on an actual aircraft loading example. So let me walk through this, and even if this is painfully obvious to you guys, it's good exercise to kind of get geared up for the airplane example. So in this example, and like I said, the FAA will say, okay, you've got a 50-pound weight, 100-pound weight, your fulcrum with known distances, 50 inches, 25 inches, and then you've got a 50-pound weight way out here with an unknown arm, with an unknown moment arm. So, of course, like we said before, to balance the beam, the moments on each side must be equal. And so the FAA on the written test will say, well, what is that arm? How far away is that 50-pound weight to balance it? So just walk through this example. Moment 1 equals moment 2, which of course means force times arm for 1 and force times arm for 2 added together, since they're on the same side of the fulcrum, must equal force times arm for 3. And so the math works itself out if you plug all the numbers in for arm 3 to equal 100 inches. Now they may ask for weights. They may give you all the arms and say, well, how much weight must you put at 100 inches out to balance the beam? And so you'll have to show your proficiency of just plugging and chugging algebraic stuff here to get the unknown variable. All good? All understandable up to this point?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Okay. Okay. I'm going to switch over here. We're going to go to spreadsheet. We're going to go through some airplane examples. So, and I'm just going to, throughout this, I'm just going to use the same aircrafts, just so it make it a little easier to understand as we go through this. But there's my CG operating envelope right here over to the right. I've got a maximum gross weight of 2650, denoted by this top line up here. And I'm going on a flight, and I know all my weights here, and my moment arms are all known because, from a aircraft perspective, if we're talking about one aircraft, we'll be able to get that in our pilot's operating handbook. So the pilot's operating handbook will tell you how many inches aft of datum, so behind the datum point, all of these points act. And so plug that into our spreadsheet. And at the end of the day, what I'm interested in is this number, my total weight, right, which is already calculated, and my total moment. So that, similar to what we talked about back here, I can find my center of gravity. If I know my total weight, total force, and I know my total moments, I can find my center of gravity. And so when you do your weight and balance calculations, you're always going to lay it out like this in a table format. You're always going to have weight and arm, weight and arm. And your weight times your arm is your moment. So we're going to calculate this. I don't know if you guys are spreadsheet junkies, but we're just going to go through here, and we're going to run this all the way down.
Chris and I just finished our MBA. We're definitely spreadsheet junkies.
Oh, you're totally spreadsheet junkies. Absolutely. We'll start doing VLOOKUPs and crazy shit like that in a minute.
Now you're talking dirty.
Yeah. So now I've found all my moments, right? Because I've multiplied my force by my arm. And like I said, the moments, you can sum the moments and you can sum the weights and divide the two, and you've got your center of gravity, or your effectively your moment arm for the aircraft's, where the aircraft will balance all its weight. And we happen to be at 88.76. So let's take a look.
Could you put the select cell E11 real quick?
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, just making sure I got that.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, so we're taking total moments and dividing total forces, or total weight. And we're lucky today with this loading scenario, because 88.76 is within the envelope. It's right here, and 2592 is below our gross weight. So if I had to put a point here, I'm going to go right 25, 26, somewhere in that neighborhood right there. Within the envelope, within the operating envelope, totally legal, totally safe. And even speaking from a within the envelope perspective, it's relatively central. It's not over here, it's not all the way forward. It's looking pretty good. This aircraft's going to be relatively controllable, well within limits.
So, obvious question, but throughout flight, I'm guessing, obviously this dot's going to move as you start consuming fuel because the plane will become lighter. Is it strictly a vertical move, or is it more diagonal?
Yeah, let's do that calculation real quick. I'm glad you brought that up. Let's do that calculation. So obviously the empty weight aircraft's not going to change, right? No one's going to be losing or gaining weight during the flight, but fuel is going to change, like you said. So I guess just for extreme example, let's just say you run out of fuel. So now, obviously, our total weight is lower, 2,300, and because of that, our moment arm for the center of gravity is going to change. Of course, the total moments change as well, because we took a bunch of fuel out. But now let's plot this one, 87.98 and 2304.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I expected, but yeah, so cool. Okay.
Yeah, and if you think about it, I mean, just again, like you said, it may be obvious, but theoretically speaking, if you've got a center of gravity right here at the 80, whatever it was, 88.7 mark, if your fuel tank has a moment arm more forward or more aft, it will affect how that center of gravity changes. For instance, if let's say your fuel tank was way in the back of the airplane, it would affect where this second center of gravity dot will show up near the end of your flight than if it was, you know, in the wings in the middle of the airplane.
Yeah, I was just noticing that. It's almost like a sum product.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So the longer the moment arm, the more that weight
Affects
impacts your
yeah.
total moment arm.
You bet.
Yeah, that just makes sense. Okay, cool.
Yeah. Yeah, and so it's actually one of the reasons that like tri-jet aircraft or like aft engine jets like an MD-80 or a 727 become or have become less popular designs, because as fuel is burned in the wings, the tail end of the aircraft becomes a lot heavier because the engines are back there. And so that's why a lot of those type of aircraft designs started dying out. Those aircraft have been involved in a lot of spin stall accidents and issues with tail heavy configurations. So
you still see that design quite a bit on the newer Embraer aircrafts for those regional jets. Have they just decided to cope with it, or is the plane configuration somewhat adapted for that weight? And I mean by adapted, like they've designed more weight at the front of the plane to counter for the engines being on the tail?
could be, but you know, their latest design, the 195 or the 190, 195, those are under wing.
I hadn't. Oh yeah, I think I have seen some of those. Okay, yeah, good point.
Yeah, but you know what though, business jets, I mean, you hardly see any business jets with underwing. They're all tail, and that's, you know, it's probably a compromise between what kind of engine size you have and how low the aircraft sits to the ground type thing. So using this example, I just want to point out, we won't go through completely, but I want to point out there's two other types of calculations you can do for weight and balance. And again, during your written test and stuff, you're expected to know how to do these methods as well. But you've got the graphical method. Let me zoom up here, where the moment calculation is performed on an actual graph. So, for example, if we're going to do the pilot and front passengers, which I'm saying is 350 pounds, we start over here at the 350. We draw a line over to the pilot and front passengers line, and then we reference the horizontal axis to get our moments, which is almost 30,000. I think this is in thousands, yeah, 1,000 inch-pounds. So if we go back here, that number should be like 29 something, 28, yeah, 28,175. And so you do, you know, for the graphical method, you do that for each loading sequence. So you've got the pilot and front passengers, you then do your fuel and your aft passengers and your baggage. And that, you know, this method is for folks who just don't feel like doing multiplication, really. So
just addition.
Yeah, just addition. And you get, I mean, you get the same answer, because you still have to sum up the moments and divide by the weight. But there's also the tabular method, by far my least favorite. But you'll have to show proficiency how to do this. It's crazy. And I've never run across an operating handbook that has this in it. I've never seen an application in real life where you actually do this. But you essentially, it takes a lot of the math out of it. Like, for instance, I don't even have to know that fuel weighs 6 pounds per gallon. I can just go, you know, 25 gallons, 150 pounds, and there's my moment right there. occupants. You go around the circle here, get all your moments from the tables, and you still have to do addition, right? Like Alan said, you still have to do math. But
So, is there like a checklist that has holders for these? Like you write those numbers in, then you sum it up as part of your pre-flight check, or are you having to do this on a piece of scratch paper? Are you doing this in your head?
I actually do. Let me pull something up here. I do. I mean, in the old days, yeah, you just do pencil paper. And to be honest with you, if you're on like a flight test, if you're doing like a flight test with an FAA examiner, they would love to see you do it with pencil and paper, so that they know you understand the concepts.
Does it have to be a number 2 pencil?
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, but like I don't know if you guys have heard of the ForeFlight app, but you know, there's like tools out there nowadays where, you know, you don't even have to. You can just punch stuff in your iPad, and it'll pull it right up for you. You know, there's some pretty nifty stuff out there. I'm trying to find a bigger picture here. Yeah, you know, you just punch in what, you know, here's how much Brett weighs, here's how much John weighs, and Jessica, and you know, boom, 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 and it just freaking plots it right there on the screen.
That's awesome.
Oh yeah, it's easy these days.
So I'm guessing the FAA needs to know that you know how to do this, and then they'll say go use the app.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things. Like I'll tell a short story. You know, the iPad's great, right? You got charts on there, maps. But when I went in for my last check ride, I brought paper charts. They asked me to do a weight and balance. I did it on paper with a calculator by hand. They wanted to see, you know, asking me questions wanted me to draw things on the chart, you know, get out the paper chart, asking questions about regulations. I brought the FAA, Federal Aviation Regulations manual, 600-page manual paper. You know, there's some old school people, there's some old school examiners that love to see that stuff. So depends, you know, depends. A lot of times your flight instructor will know the examiner. And I was given a friendly heads up by my instructor, said, hey, when you go take your exam, don't bring your iPad. And I was like, yes, sir. So.
Adam, how do they calculate that on commercial flights? Because you don't have to give them your weight.
Well, the FAA actually publishes average weights of certain ethnicities. And also by time of year. So the FAA says, I'm making these numbers up, but a Caucasian male in the wintertime on average weighs 210 pounds. And a Caucasian female in the summertime weighs on average 130. And so the airlines, they'll take the passenger manifest, and they'll do their weight and balance based on that.
Huh.
Yeah.
Okay.
What's that?
There's room for error there, though.
Well, yes, I was actually going to ask something. It sounds sort of like a flippant question, but it wasn't meant to be. You know, I remember about a decade ago, Houston was considered the fattest city in America, and I was just curious if they sort of took into account demographics or trends in a particular area. You know, some regions of the world, like Nepal, for instance, natural-born Nepalese people are quite a bit smaller and shorter and less weight than, say, a more well-fed American city. You know, I'm just curious, do they always stick to those sort of rough statistics because the law of averages tends to win, or do they maybe make more tweaks and adjustments based upon where they're at?
Well, I think there's a couple things to consider, and it's a good question. First of all, you know, most airliners, I won't say all because I'm not 100% sure, but most modern day airliners have a onboard weight and balance system in the cockpit. So if you've ever been on an airplane and they come back and say, we need like 5 people to move to row 16 or whatever.
Yep.
Yeah, so that's because the pilot's looking on his control panel and it says, oh, your aircraft's out of balance limitations. So that's one thing. The second thing to consider too, and I don't know what kind of safety factors are built into jet aircraft, but they are significantly more powerful. They probably have a wider margin for error. That somebody has probably done a study saying that the averages fall, you know, the the standard deviation would fall within like the aircraft's safety factor. Those are my thoughts. I know most aircraft these days do, though, have those systems on board that tells the pilot how much the aircraft weighs and where it's loaded at from a CG standpoint.
Cool.
Yeah. All right. So let's go back here. Let me see. I've got a couple other examples, and it seems like you guys are pretty comfortable with the math.
Yeah, I thought you were going to have much more difficult math than that.
Oh, I hyped it up, huh?
Well, I don't want to say anything because you could have more in the rafters waiting, but some multiplication, division, and math, addition I can handle. If you're throwing integrals up there, I might be hosed.
Oh man, shit, I wouldn't be able to handle that either. So why don't we, let's do this. Why don't you guys take like 3 minutes, 5 minutes? I've got a couple examples on the screen. I just want to let you guys work them so you can go through the exercise, and then I'll do them on the screen and we can compare notes. How's that sound?
Fun.
Okay. Real quick, because the airplane is different here. Let me go through the assumptions. So the fuel tanks are 80 gallons, 74 of which are usable. The CG range is 76 to 84 inches. Max gross weight 3,200 pounds. Aircraft empty weight 2325, and let's assume that we're going to be taking 100 pounds of bags on the airplane. So let you guys work through that one, then we'll come back together.
Are you gonna leave those numbers up?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, just a second. There we go. Okay.
Alan, can you go on mute? It keeps going to your screen.
Sure, but if you just click on the Adams icon at the bottom, it'll freeze that picture up at the top.
Okay. Got it. I see that. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
I should probably put this on here too. I'm sorry, because I did not explain this yet. 1 gallon of avgas equals 6 pounds. Sorry about that.
This might be a dumb question, but why is it called moment arm versus just arm? Because if moment is, well, force times arm.
Mm-hmm.
Is it nomenclature or?
I've heard it both ways. I mean, I think probably the official term is moment arm.
Okay.
Yeah, the distance for which a force acts is typically called the moment arm. Sometimes I call it just arm because I get confused, not confused, but it's like, okay, there's a moment and a moment arm, so one or the other type thing. But yeah, moment arm is probably more popular.
Okay.
Let me know when you guys are wrapping up, or if there's confusion, we can go through it.
I have an answer.
Got an answer? Emily and Chris?
Yes.
Yes? It's like Jeopardy.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so let's go through this. So what am I going to do first?
Multiply weight times moment arm for
Got it.
each line item.
All right, and then what value am I putting in there for fuel?
$4.44.
That's what I got too.
444.
Wait, how'd you get that?
6 times 74. So, so the aircraft's empty weight always includes the unusable portion of the fuel tank, and probably should have talked about unusable fuel a little bit more. In the aircraft fuel tank, similar to your car tank, really, there's a portion of the tank that's not usable. Meaning, if your engine runs out of gas, there's still a little bit of fuel in the tank. In this case, for this particular example aircraft, I've got 6 gallons total are not usable, and that weight is included in the empty weight, so it's already in this 2325 number.
Okay.
So when I calculate fuel, I'm only going to calculate the usable amount.
Thank you.
Yep. Now, I will say you have to be careful, and this is why when you learn to fly different airplanes, you're going to study the pilot's operating handbook. Sometimes the pilot's operating handbook doesn't use basic empty weight. Sometimes they use the empty weight that includes, that doesn't include the unusable fuel. So you'll have to include that in your fuel calculation. It depends on which parameter the operating handbook has you use. And if you include it and you weren't supposed to, it's probably not a huge deal because it's only 6 gallons. It's probably not going to throw off the calculation. But okay, so I've got some of my moments, and then what's the next step?
Sorry, I got muted.
Can you guys hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Emily, you keep muting me. Yeah, all right, I'll go quiet.
Oh, okay. So sum of your weights, right? You want to get your total force. And then to find my moment arm, I'm just going to divide my total moments by my total force. And wow. So what can all at once now, what can you tell me about this loading scenario?
It's outside of the allowable limits.
Mm-hmm. Yep, because the maximum gross weight for the aircraft, meaning the maximum that it can weigh for takeoff, is above 3,200 pounds. It's coming in at 3,579. And the allowable CG range, center of gravity range, is 76 to 84, and it's coming in at 90. And if this was an aircraft where the datum is the nose, so I'm going to go back here real quick just to illustrate. If this is an example where the datum is the nose of the aircraft, and the limit is whatever it was, 70 to 80, and we're at 90, it means that the center of gravity is actually back here in the tail. It's further away than the limit. It's at 90. So that means your aircraft is loaded too far aft.
And you're going to end up in the picture that you showed us at the very beginning of the lesson.
That's right. You end up damaging a very expensive aircraft. Oh, yeah. And so, I'll be honest with you, the one very advantageous reason to use a spreadsheet or an iPad is because when you end up in this scenario, you can very easily determine what you have to do to your loading scenario to get back within limits. So, maybe I tell my passengers they can't come on the flight, and maybe I have to grab less fuel. And then you can get yourself back into limits very quickly. All right. So you guys feel pretty comfortable with the math? I've got another example if you want to go through it, but if everybody's pretty comfortable, we can rock and roll.
I feel pretty good.
Pretty good?
Yeah, I'm good.
Good?
Yes.
Good. Okay, cool. Okay. Now, like I mentioned before, you know, the examiner or the written test, they're going to test your knowledge on weight and balance, both from a fulcrum or seesaw perspective, and from a real airplane application perspective, and they're also, as it involves the real airplane application weight and balance calculation, they're going to want to see you do what's called a weight shift problem, or calculate a weight shift scenario. And it's really, the benefit is just to make sure you understand weight and balance. You'll likely never use these equations in real life, but it helps, it helps that you understand them so that you know how to calculate differences in center of gravity. And who knows, maybe you will find this to be applicable in your real world flying. But with today's technology, iPads, etc., and even spreadsheets, which isn't really new technology, you can shift weight around in your equations very easily and figure it out. But you'll see a problem like this on the written test, and you might even have to do one in front of the examiner, where you shift a weight from one area of the plane to another. So this example, we're shifting 100 pounds from station 80.5 to station 142.8, and we're just going to use the same airplane as we did in the first example. So I've got, essentially, I'm shifting 100 pounds from the front seat to the baggage area. And by the way, you'll hear the term station, and that just means the different locations as defined by the pilot's operating handbook. Okay, so I'm going to go through this. There's really two methods to do this, and both are equally fine. I use the second method. When I took the test, I used the second method because it's easier to understand the equation. But essentially, to do this quickly, you're going to want to find the total difference in moments. So the difference in this case would be the 100 times the 142 versus the 100 times the 80. Because if you think about it conceptually, you're removing 100 pounds from the 80.5 location. So that's coming out. You're adding 100 pounds to the 142.8 location. That's going in. So there is a difference in moments with respect to the datum, to the nose of the aircraft. And in this particular example, that number's 6230 inch pounds. And the final step is we're going to take that moment difference, and we're going to add or subtract it to the already existing moment. So the moment prior to moving the weight was 230,076,000 inch pounds. And because we're moving the weight further aft, which is in the positive direction from the datum, remember the datum is the nose of the aircraft, we're going to add the moment difference. So essentially what we're doing, if you think about it from a seesaw perspective, is we're taking that big 200-pound dude and we're moving him further away from the fulcrum. We're moving him further back, thus increasing the total moment, which is why we add that moment difference to the original moment. And then the rest is simple, just like we did before. Calculate the new center of gravity by taking moments divided by weight. So the new moment, which is 236,306, divided by the 2592 total weight, and we've got a new CG of 91.17. Which, in our specific example, I think we're outside of limits. Oh no, we're there. Right over here. So does that make sense conceptually? Two-step process: find the moment difference, and then add or subtract that difference to the original moment.
Yeah, I guess my only question is it just kind of confirm what you said? If you're moving away from the center of gravity towards the tail, you'll add the difference. If you're moving toward the nose of the plane from the center of gravity, you'll subtract the gravity.
Right.
The moment.
Right.
The moment. Okay.
Right. Yeah, because right now, as it stands, with the 100 pounds sitting right here in the front seat, your moment is a 230.076. If we're going to decrease the arm of the center of gravity, it's going to go down. So your CG will move to the left. It'll go towards the nose.
Okay.
Okay. So yeah, let me check some real quick. Ah, yes. My slides are out of order here. There's a second way to calculate this, and it's my preferred method, even though that first method's pretty simple. But there's an equation that, think back to school. I know, Chris and Alan, you just recently finished schooling, but maybe you guys can, memorizing formulas, where you kind of memorize a formula, take it to the test with you, and write it down right when you get there.
Yep.
So that is the name of the game with this kind of equation. You memorize the formula, you write it down when you get there, knowing that you may never use it ever again. But either way, the math is essentially, it's the same exact math. It's just in this format. You take the weight shifted divided by the aircraft's total weight. And on the other side of the equation ratio is the change in the center of gravity divided by the distance that the weight was shifted. So if you were to reconfigure this equation, it would look exactly like the first method. This just happens to be, to me, a little easier to understand. You don't have to remember like plus or minus for the whether to add or subtract from the current moment. You just kind of plug in numbers and go. And so for this particular example, 100 pounds of weight is shifted, 2592 is the total weight. The distance shifted is 62.3, and so we just solve for the delta CG. So 2.404, and if you add that to the 87.98, you'll get the 91.17. So to me, just a much easier, more concise way to understand how to solve the problem.
Yeah, cool. I like that way a lot better.
Yes, same here. And you may, I don't want to sound cavalier. You may actually use this in your flying. Depending on what you get into. I typically, it's either myself and Emily, or myself and a flight instructor. You're not doing a lot of weight shifting. You're not having to account for a lot of variables, but maybe you'll go for camping trips. Maybe you'll load the aircraft up with a lot of bags, and you realize, oh, I gotta actually move some bags from the baggage compartment to the back seat, because that makes even 2 feet can make a huge difference. If you don't feel like getting your iPad out, you just get out a piece of engineering paper and go to town. But the examiners will be very impressed if you can do this on paper. They like to see it.
But all of it is in the ForeFlight app as well?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, this will do everything for you. I mean, the ForeFlight app will not have this particular equation in it, but if I go back to the, let's see, where did I put that? If you go back and look at the screen, what you can do is just play around with numbers. I mean, you can, yeah, you can literally just, you know, if you're falling outside of limits, you can just start playing around with this. You know, you can't change people's weights necessarily, but if you've got, like in this case, 105 pounds of luggage, you know, maybe some of that luggage has to sit on Jim's lap. So you take 50 pounds of it and throw it on Jim's lap. And survival pack, well, you know, maybe that goes on the front floorboard. You just start like playing with numbers to make it fall within. You won't necessarily do that particular equation on the app, but I mean, you know, in some regards, playing around with numbers is more intuitive, right?
Yeah.
Get it to work. Just get it to fall in. So, yeah, you know, and when you do, most of the time when you do your weight and balance, for sure, in your flight planning will be when you have a fully loaded aircraft. 90% of the general aviation aircraft that have 4 seats can't actually hold 4 people from a weight perspective, unless you compromise on something else like fuel. I know one time my parents visited Fort Worth, and in order to take four of us for a flight, I had to siphon out like 25 gallons of fuel from the fuel tanks. So if you're going to have in a 4-place aircraft, if you're going to have all 4 seats occupied, 9 times out of 10 you'll have to compromise with most likely fuel. So you'll definitely be doing a weight and balance to make sure that you fall in.
So you won't be able to go as long distances?
There you go. Yeah, you won't be able to. You will not be able to fly as far on half a tank. And what makes it more complicating is you've got half a tank, so you obviously can't go as far, but your plane's also fully loaded. And what we said before in the start of the session, you know, when your plane's fully loaded, it will not perform as well as when it's you know, lighter. So it, you know, that'll be going against you as well. Now that's actually a good segue. I'm glad you brought that up, Chris, because I want to show you guys. We're going to get into this a little bit more in next week's session, but I do want to point something out to you guys in the Pilot's Operating Handbook. Let me get there. Okay. Let's go to a performance chart here. Okay, here's the climb performance chart. You look at the assumptions here on the chart, the full throttle, the gear and flaps. What do you guys notice here on the assumptions as far as this chart's concerned? Any good guesses?
It's at the max weight.
Yeah. So you notice in the example that we've been using throughout this session, the 2650, which is in this particular aircraft the maximum weight, 2650. Your performance charts will all be, or rather, your aircraft is going to be certificated at a maximum gross weight, and all your performance charts are going to be depicted in maximum gross weight. Any good guesses as why that might be?
Because that's when it's the hardest to maneuver?
Exactly, yes. That's when your aircraft is going to perform at its, I'll call it worst. Okay, so for example, in this particular chart, if we were just going to calculate a climb performance, let's just assume, make it easy here, a density altitude of 2,000 feet is going to give you a rate of climb of 800 feet per minute, as long as we have all these assumptions here. And so as a pilot, what I know, because I know that operating at my maximum gross weight is when my aircraft performs the worst. I know that if it's a 2,000 foot density altitude and my aircraft weighs 2,200 pounds, I'm going to get a better rate of climb. I'm not going to get an 800 foot per minute. I'll probably get closer to 9 or 1,000 feet per minute. And so the performance charts are published with the worst case scenario in mind from a weight perspective, so that you know the limits of performance on your aircraft. If let me use maybe a more conclusive example. Let's do a takeoff really quick. We'll do a takeoff chart. Where are we at? Takeoff performance 9.2. Okay, takeoff performance. So you're at an airport, okay, that has a 1,000 foot runway, and so you're thinking to yourself, well, is 1,000 feet, enough distance for my aircraft to actually take off? And so you do the calculation, density, altitude versus takeoff distance, and you know that I will be able to get a 1,000 foot ground run. Ground run is another word for takeoff distance. At around 2,000 foot density altitude, if my aircraft is fully loaded, 2650. If my aircraft's, because weight greatly affects performance, like we talked about, if I'm loaded at 22 or 2,300 pounds, I know it's going to take off sooner than 1,000 feet in a 2,000 foot density altitude scenario. I don't know by how much, but I know it's going to be better than 1,000 feet. And so you utilize in your performance charts your worst case scenario at the point at which your aircraft is heaviest. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. And also important to keep in mind that like Alan had pointed out earlier when we were doing the calculations, as you're flying the airplane, you're going to lose weight through the consumption of fuel. So when you're doing your performance calculations, which we'll get more into during the next session, you're going to have a different weight when you're coming into land, and you got to kind of take that into consideration. And also, and we're going to go through some examples here in a minute, but you've got pilots out there that are become a little bit careless with regard to weight and balance, and they'll operate their aircraft at 2,700, 2,750, 2,800, really testing the limits. And you can see that the performance charts, they're not certificated for those weights. So when they tested the airframe with a test pilot, they only tested to 2,650. They did not test this particular aircraft past that point. So that's why it's a very important weight to keep in mind.
Do they have different charts, Adam, when I scroll up to the top and it talks about, zero wind or, sorry, I can't see. Yeah, zero wind and paved level drive runway. Like, do they have different inclement weather conditions factored into this? Yeah,
let me see if there's actually this one might have it. If they don't, I'll pull up another one, but let's see here. Landing performance, no, does not have it. If you guys give me just a quick second, let me pull up another one. Got another one in here. No. All right, here's another Aero operating handbook. And short answer to your question is yes, and I'll show it to you. Okay, let's see. Okay, all right, this is kind of an eye chart, but let's look at it here. Okay, so this particular performance chart is a 25-degree flap takeoff. So the pilot will set their flaps to first notch or 25 degrees on this aircraft over a 50-foot barrier. So you know, a lot of general aviation airports that we're going to fly into are going to are not going to be like you know, Houston Intercontinental. They're not going to have 200-foot wide runways with no trees at the end, right? A lot of our airports we fly in and out of are going to have you know, some sort of obstacle. And so the manufacturers will publish charts that take into account what's called a 50-foot barrier. It's your aircraft's capability to take off and clear a 50-foot obstacle, and essentially how far or what distance does that take. And so you can see the conditions here is 2,700 RPM, wing flaps 25, paved level dry runway. And this particular chart, to your point, Chris, takes wind into account. So it takes actually a bunch of parameters into account. This particular chart isn't even a max gross weight chart. This allows you to vary your weight. So you take your air temperature and you intersect your, and again, this chart is extremely it's a little involved, but you know, the parameters involved in the chart are air temperature, pressure, altitude, and you intersect where your air temperature and your pressure altitude are, and you draw a horizontal line, kind of like in the example here, if you can kind of see it, over to your aircraft weight, and you intersect your aircraft weight. And then you draw another horizontal line over here to your wind, and you intersect your headwind or your tailwind. And then you come out with a takeoff distance over a 50-foot obstacle. So yeah, to answer your question, some aircraft, some more advanced aircraft, will have charts in here where they have done flight testing in certain wind conditions and you know, atmospheric conditions and different weights, so that you can get a more precise answer. For sure.
Thanks.
Yep. A lot of the airplanes that you'll fly when you start out in your training, you just want to make sure what the assumptions are. A lot of them will go up to max gross weight, but you want to be sure just in case. Okay, back to it. And so we talked, of course, Chris, you pointed out the picture of the MD-11 that was loaded to the tail and had an issue there on the front page. When you're flying your aircraft, where your center of gravity is located and how much it weighs, how much your aircraft weighs, will have significant effects on aircraft handling and controllability. And so I want to briefly talk those quickly. And so, like we said before, you know, your aircraft, typically you will not do any calculations for lateral weight and balance. It's all about controlling fuel, you know, how much fuel is draining from the left wing versus the right wing. Some aircraft, like Cessna, will have the ability to drain from both at the same time, so you don't even have to think about it. So from a controllability perspective, we're only really going to be concerned about longitudinal, forward versus aft. And so, of course, in those scenarios, you have a loading too far forward versus loading too far aft, and of course, you've got the sweet spot, or typically within the CG limitations. So if you are loading your aircraft forward of the forward CG limit, to no surprise, it'll be a nose-heavy aircraft. It will take significant amount of pressure on the elevator to keep the aircraft at a straight and level, constant altitude configuration. Probably more importantly, though, is upon landing, your aircraft will want to land nose first. You'll have your elevator control will be limited to the point where you may encounter nose gear first landings, damage the propeller, or worse, if you're flying a tailwheel aircraft, potentially nose the aircraft over, flip the aircraft forward. when you start your flight training and you learn takeoffs and landings, you'll get an appreciation for landing on the main landing gear, the gear that are located beneath the wings. Nose first landings typically do not end well, especially if the entire weight of the aircraft lands on the nose. So for purposes of effective landing, you always want to make sure that you're not flirting with the forward CG limit of your aircraft. And conversely, on the aft end, you want to keep your aircraft loaded with within the aft limitation due to tail heavy, undesirable longitudinal stability issues. Now, when you look at the two, nose heavy versus tail heavy turns out to be a lot more dangerous, has caused a lot more aircraft accidents, and the primary reason is the undesirable stall characteristics. When you not necessarily in cruise flight, but when you're slowing down for approach and landing, you're going to be effectively stalling the aircraft to make your landing right above touchdown. And if you get too slow on final approach and your aircraft is loaded aft of the weight and balance limitations, your aircraft will have a greater tendency to stall and stall at a higher airspeed than it would if it was loaded properly. What's more is if you have stalled your aircraft and your wings stop generating lift, because it's so tail heavy, it will be very hard to regain direct wind flow over the wings. You could enter what's called a flat spin. Now, have you guys ever been to an air show and seen like an aerobatic aircraft go into a flat spin?
Yes.
It essentially, if your aircraft is spinning around its longitudinal axis, there's no elevator authority because it's too heavy in the back end to pitch the nose down. The only way you'll get out of that spin is if you can pitch the nose down to allow gravity to get the airplane moving forward. If your airplane's too tail heavy, it'll just spin around that axis and actually never be able to nose over. I've got a picture here on the bottom right. That's a traditional spin, nose first, nose dive spin. And the way you get out of that spin is by gaining forward momentum. Of course, you're doing a nosedive, so you obviously want to pull out of it before you hit the ground. But the way the aircraft regains lift is by nosediving down, gaining forward momentum, and getting relative wind to go over the wings and produce lift. If you're in a flat spin, because your aircraft's tail heavy, it doesn't have the ability to nose over and do a nosedive spin. It'll sit there and spin in a horizontal plane all the way to the ground. So when you do your flight planning, you definitely stay away from the aft limit and definitely do not go beyond it. Could be very, very dangerous. When you do your flight training, get your pilot's license and start taking passengers for a spin, you'll notice this tail heavy characteristics very quickly. You start putting passengers in the back seat with cargo, with baggage. Becomes extremely noticeable, the different handling characteristics of the aircraft due to the center of gravity moving further aft. All right, time check. Let's see. Okay, we're doing pretty good. I want to go through a couple accidents. But before we do that, any questions on the calculations or the theory, the physics, anything that wasn't quite clear?
I'm good.
I am as well.
Good, okay. All right, so I pulled out a couple of incidents from NTSB reports. Unfortunately, no cool videos from AOPA relative to weight and balance accidents, but I did want to go over these because these were pretty directly related to weight and balance. We'll go to the Springville one first. Let me pull it up here. Here we go. Yeah, I think this is it. Yeah. So there was a police unit or a sheriff's unit that were flying this LSA. It's called light sport aircraft. And it was improperly loaded, over gross weight. I forget if the NTSB report talks about where the center of gravity was, but essentially, unfortunately, these folks crashed the aircraft due to their improper loading. So I'll put this on the screen. I'm also just going to read it so you can read or listen. Airplane, owned and operated by local county sheriff's department, was on a low altitude observation flight. According to GPS data recovered from the aircraft about 1 minute before the accident, the airplane was flying westbound over a highway 500 feet above the ground speed of 52 knots. GPS data and witness observations indicated that the airplane entered a left turn. According to the witnesses, the airplane's wings then dipped left and right. The airplane descended to ground impact. The witnesses heard the engine operating in a steady tone until ground impact. Post-crash fire ensued and destroyed the aircraft. Now this is the important part. It's related to our lesson. Examination of the wreckage did not reveal evidence of any pre-impact mechanical malfunctions or anomalies that would have precluded normal operation. The airplane's estimated weight at the time of the accident was 152 pounds over maximum gross weight. And so for that aircraft, 152 pounds is actually quite a bit, because I bet fully loaded it shouldn't weigh more than like 1,600 pounds, 1,700 pounds. So that's a decent percentage over gross weight. And this next sentence is key. Because of the higher gross weight, the airplane's stall speed in a 30-degree bank turn was 3 knots higher than it would have been in the airplane's maximum gross weight. What can you guys tell me about that we learned in a prior session? What can you tell me about a banked turn, in this case 30 degrees? What can you tell me about the aircraft's aerodynamic or stall characteristics?
The stall speed actually goes up.
That's right. The load factor on the aircraft increases because of the turn, and yes, the stall speed goes up. So not only are they overweight, but they're stressing the aircraft on a 30-degree bank turn. And yeah, so this resulted in a stall speed of 48 knots calibrated, which was near the airplane's recorded ground speed of 52 knots. So, so as you can see, not that the pilots could have, I guess, noticed a 3-knot difference in stall speed, because they were probably busy trying to fly the airplane. But based on the gross weight condition being over the maximum, they were flying the airplane based on how they learned to fly it and how they, how they are used to flying it. And they now have this over gross weight situation, and it cannot be flown in the same manner. And so because of that, they crashed the aircraft and expired. So just this is one example of why it's important to do all math prior to loading up the airplane and going. And I think I've got just one more NTSB to look at. So this one was Alaska. And I think this one, let's read it. I think this has to do with CG. So the airline transport pilot was conducting an on-demand charter flight in a wheel ski-equipped airplane. That sounds cool. With 3 passengers and climbing gear aboard. The flight was en route to a mountain climbing base camp located on a glacier, 7,200-foot MSL. So this guy is operating his aircraft in high altitude conditions. A passing airplane discovered the accident wreckage at 8,200-foot level of a remote mountain pass along the anticipated flying route. The summit of the pass is situated about 9,000-foot MSL oriented east-west. So this was a Cessna 185. I think that's a tail wheel version of the 182. So this isn't a jet. This isn't anything special. A piston aircraft operating at high altitudes. The flight's anticipated direction of travel to the base camp was westbound. The airplane wreckage came to a rest atop snow-covered glacial terrain within a large U-shaped upsloping valley. The nose of the airplane was oriented in the opposite direction of the flight's anticipated direction of travel. The airplane struck the snow-covered terrain in a near horizontal position. Take note of that particular observation, a near horizontal position. Wings level, 5 degrees nose down. The NTSB investigator in charge documented all passenger, pilot, and cargo positions. After recovery, actual occupant and climbing gear cargo weights documented. The gross weight of the airplane at the time of the accident was estimated to be 20 pounds over the plane's maximum gross weight limit of 3,350. Since there are no center of gravity limits for weights over maximum gross weight, the estimated CG of the airplane at the time of the accident, 154 inches, was compared to the limits at maximum gross weight of 140 to 156 and found to be near the aft limit. So, what can you guys tell me about this particular scenario? What's interesting here?
It looks like the weight was in the aft of the plane.
Correct. So based on forward versus aft loading limitations, how does that affect being loaded too far aft? How does that affect the controllability of the aircraft?
It increases the risk of a flat spin.
That's right. And look what they've got. They've got an observation that the airplane struck the snow-covered terrain near horizontal position, wings level. So the aircraft likely entered a flat spin.
And the nose was pointed in the opposite direction of the expected direction of travel.
That's it. So it probably like your point being, it probably rotated, right? Rotated about the vertical axis. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, it's insane how different, and you guys will definitely get an appreciation for this when you do your training and you start putting people in the back seat and bags, and it completely changes the flying handling characteristics. Oh, by the way, this guy was flying at 9,000 feet MSL. I mean,
I was just about to ask that question, actually. Yeah, how much? I mean, given that the 154.1 inches of the moment arm was within the 140 to 156 range, it seems that because they were so close to the limit and at a much higher altitude, that may have, increased the risk of flat spin.
No doubt, absolutely. I'll tell you guys, I've only done two high altitude flights in my flying career. Once to Los Alamos, New Mexico, and another one to Denver. And both times, just to give you an idea of the power required from a piston prop airplane when you're operating at those altitudes, to maintain a appropriate descent path down to landing on approach. Again, a point at which the aircraft is close to stalling because you're landing. I had to have about 60% throttle in, about 60% power, 2,300 RPM on a 2,700 RPM max aircraft to combat the density altitude from the high altitude flying, right? Whereas at sea level, the throttle would have been at maybe 20%, 1,400 RPM. So yeah, it's the thin air, the density altitude, which which obviously it hurts your lift, it hurts your engine performance, it hurts your propeller efficiency. So yeah, this and with the aft loading, I mean, it's just this particular one's just a complete recipe for failure. So you have to keep that in mind when you're doing your flight planning. All right, and then I've got, let's do one video. I do have a video. I won't leave us without a video because I want to just visually kind of give you guys an idea of what an aft loading scenario looks like. Let me paste this into the chat. Ooh. All right. Oh, where did my chat go?
If you move your cursor to the left side, you should see a little toolbar pop out, and then you'll see a little blue square.
There we go.
Click that.
All right, there we go. There's the link. It's not too long, so why don't you guys pop that in your browser. I'm going to go on mute and then come off mute after you guys are done watching it.
Wow.
Yeah, isn't that just nuts?
I think what was amazing to me was here's a massive plane with massive power, and it's like someone just grabbed the tail and stopped flight.
Yeah, and in that case, the you know, the performance handling wasn't even really, you couldn't even really classify that as a flat spin. It just basically got pulled backwards. Yeah, the engines weren't even powerful enough to keep it in horizontal flight.
So a part of, am I understanding this right? A part of the cargo shifted back.
That's
You know, I mean, how do you prevent that?
yeah,
Locked down and fastened, and it wasn't.
yeah, somebody didn't get the right fasteners. I don't know. Yeah, from what I understand on the news report, it just, yeah, a bunch of cargo shifted back towards the back end of the plane.
It said that they found broken straps, suggesting that maybe the straps were improperly rated for the equipment size, perhaps.
Perhaps, yeah,
perhaps. Or maybe they were worn or torn and frayed, perhaps.
Yeah.
In the video right above that one, when I clicked on it, they have like a diagram, a simulation of the tankers and how they moved back.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah, I see the one you're talking about, Emily.
Oh yeah, sudden shifting. Oh, that's cool. Huh.
So it's
yeah.
at around 1 minute and 13 seconds in. Is where I.
Good find.
Yeah, it's. I mean, obviously the sad part is the people that did the weight and balance calculations couldn't control what happened.
Yeah.
There's a lot more careless pilots out there that don't even do don't even know what they're flying, and then they get into trouble. But yeah. So like I said, typically, as you start loading your aircraft, or when you do your training, it's going to be you, your instructor. You'll get very used to flying the airplane in that loading configuration. Then you'll do a solo, and you'll fly the aircraft solo, and you'll get used to that loading configuration. So you'll get this inherent feeling for the aircraft that you fly in those two loading scenarios, and then you'll start taking friends for flights. You'll load up the plane with vacation luggage, and that's when it's handy to start doing these calculations just as a part of being a safe and competent pilot, so that when you're taking off, not only maximum gross weight is considered and you fall within the limitations of center of gravity, but like we're going to talk about during the next session, you know exactly how your aircraft is going to perform in different flight regimes. So takeoff, climb, cruise, descent and landing. You're going to want to have a good, whether it's a mental picture or whether you're going to actually write it down so you can reference it during the flight. It's good to understand weight and balance, because it's going to affect those performance numbers. And we're going to talk about planning for flight performance in the next session. All those different flight regimes from takeoff all the way through landing. So that's the material. Do you guys have any questions at all about the calculations or the theory or the math?
No, I'm good. Actually, it was pretty straightforward.
Okay.
Adam, you mentioned that we'd start seeing the differences when we have different, exactly what you just went through. Will we see differences when we change to different planes?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, so especially as it concerns takeoff and landing, those will be the areas you'll notice the biggest difference. Takeoff, landing, and stalls. So a good example, our flying club has a pair of Beechcraft Bonanzas, which are high performance piston aircraft, and they're known for having very aggressive stall characteristics, depending on how the aircraft's loaded. If it's just you in this particular aircraft, if it's just you as the pilot, the stall characteristics are relatively easy to handle. Once you start moving the center of gravity aft on the Bonanzas, away from the, call it the midpoint of the aft forward aft limit, the stall characteristics of the aircraft become extremely aggressive, meaning if you don't attempt to recover the stall quick enough, you'll enter either a spin or a flat spin if you're loaded too far aft. And so I know in our flying club, when you get rated in the Bonanza, you have to go on to the instructor to prove competency in stall recovery, because if you've got it loaded with a lot of cargo, or you've got two backseat passengers, some people don't like sitting up in front, maybe it's a pilot and two backseat passengers, you could enter a stall situation that's not recoverable. So yeah, every airplane you fly is completely different with regards to handling and how you load it. One other good example that always comes up as you start your flight training, you're going to fly some popular single engine trainer, Cessna 172, Piper Cherokee, Cessna 152, and you will get very used to how you fly with your instructor, what the airplane feels like, takeoff, landing, cruise. And then your instructor is going to let you solo the aircraft when you're somewhere in between 12 and 20 hours into your training. And most students, I did this, most people I talk to that go through their first solo, the first thing that they mention is how surprisingly high they come in on final approach, because they didn't take into account that the airplane had like 150, 200, 250 less pounds in it, because you've got one human being in there instead of two. I know for me, soloing a Cessna 152, which only had a maximum gross weight of about 1,600 pounds, my instructor was a bigger guy, and when he got out of the airplane, we went from 1,500 or 1,600 pounds down to like 1,300 or 1,400 pounds. And I almost had to go around on my first solo trip around the pattern because I came in way high. I had, what I knew was the right throttle setting and the right angle of attack coming in, but it was too much power for the weight that was in the aircraft. So yeah, as soon as you start messing around with different loading scenarios and different aircraft, you'll get more intuitive about what the airplane feels like and stuff like that. So yeah, it'll happen right away. You'll even notice, just along that line, you'll even notice when you're flying commercial on an airline, you'll look around, you'll notice, hey, maybe the airplane's not totally full. A lot of times these days the flights are like completely jammed. But next time you get on a flight, take note if the flight's like half full and how quickly the airplane takes off. You'll notice that right away. You'll be like, oh my God, the airplane took off in like 500 feet. So even those pilots have to be extremely cognizant of how their aircraft are loaded.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Any other dialogue, comments, questions?
You mentioned that it was better to go to a flight club versus a flight school for our hours. Why is that?
Well, two real big reasons. One, aircraft availability. Typically, flying clubs will have more airplanes and better aircraft availability because there's not usually a lot of students using the airplanes. Whereas in a flight school, they almost always reserve the aircraft for student training. In the flying clubs I've been a part of, if I needed to grab an instructor and go up for a lesson, I've usually never had an issue. The airplanes are always usually relatively available. And then the second reason, which I think is more important, is once you get your license, being in a flying club allows you to take the aircraft on long cross countries for multiple days. Whereas flight schools, you typically don't have the luxury to take the aircraft away from the home base because they need their airplanes for flight training. And so I think one bad habit or one thing that new pilots fall into after they get their license, if they're at a flight school, if they continue to fly at that flight school, they'll continue to just do like hour-long flights or fly around the pattern or, you know, go for a quick lunch and come back. But you truly learn how to become a competent pilot by going on longer trips, multiple flights, flying through multiple weather patterns, different elevations. And so by being in a flying club, it affords you the ability to do those kind of trips. Every time I go on a long multi-day cross country where I'm flying the airplane, you know, 1,000, 1,500 miles away from its home base, you learn so much that you just wouldn't learn by flying flight school aircraft, because you typically can't take the plane for longer than an hour or two.
And how much does it cost to be a part of flight clubs?
Say it again.
How much does it cost to be a part of a flight club?
The particular flight club I'm in is $65 a month for dues. Mm-hmm. There's a one-time refundable application fee that you pay and you get back if you quit. That's the last club I was a part of was $50 a month. So yeah, it's not too bad.
And then the cost for when you take out the planes.
Yeah, so exactly right. So you pay the dues, that's a flat rate, and then you pay an hourly rate based on when what they call prop time, or the time that the engine's running on the aircraft.
And do these clubs have associations with other clubs across the country, or is it you just?
I haven't run into too many clubs that are not local. Flying clubs actually, from what I can tell, just became real popular in the past 10 or 15 years. But yeah, I haven't seen a club have multiple locations. It's typically one club, one airport, one home base. Whereas flight schools are different. You know, like American Flyers is a national brand flight school. What's another one? I mean, like Embry-Riddle has like 3 locations around the country. So yeah, having had experience flying both clubs and flight schools, I've really enjoyed the club experience. Another cool aspect is the camaraderie. You get to know people in the club.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you want to split time, which becomes a cost thing as you're getting your hours, you get to know, you become friends with people and see if people want to go flying and split the cost of the airplane, stuff like that.
Alan, are you listening?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Are you guys thinking about getting into a club down there?
I think we were thinking about trying to parallel our efforts for getting the actual flight time done, and given that we both live in Houston and we're both pursuing this at the same time, the buddy system you just talked about, where you're sharing time and plane, you could take turns, being lead pilot, then yeah, that seems to work out quite nice. So
I would totally agree. I told Chris I'd do some scouting. Chris, where in Houston specifically are you at in relation to like downtown?
I'm right by downtown.
Oh,
yeah,
you're downtown.
She's 2 miles from where we live, Adam.
Oh, okay, got it. Okay, all right. Yeah, I'll do some scouting. I'll see what kind of flying clubs got going on down there. See if anybody. I'm part of a Facebook group for North Texas flying clubs It's called North Texas Aviators, and they know these guys in the group know Texas real well. So I'm sure someone will have a recommendation for a flying club down there.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and then another popular thing is people go in on partnerships, stuff like that. There's if you find other people that are interested in learning to fly, you all go in on like a 172 or something, and split that cost. But flying club's nice because then you don't have the ownership headaches. You know, you can just focus on learning how to fly.
Yeah.
So.
What's the hourly rate? Sorry for all the questions.
No, you're good. This is good. What was that hourly rate?
Yeah, what is the hourly rate? Or does it change for every flight club? Is it not kind of standard, or do they have average ones?
Yeah, no, the average cost for like a training aircraft, like a 172, you know, in a flying club, including fuel, should be about $100 to $110 an hour.
Okay.
Not including fuel, probably 60 to $50 to $60 an hour. You'll always 90% of the time it'll be what's called a wet rate, which means it includes fuel. And then if you're at a flight school where there's no dues, typical training aircraft like a 172 or a Cherokee will probably run about $130 to $140 an hour. So the flying club tries to get the rate down because you're already paying the dues, the one-time monthly dues. So if you're flying twice a month, at least 2 or 3 times a month, it kind of pays for itself when you're talking from an hourly perspective.
Cool.
Yeah. Real quick, let me show you one thing before we hang up the phone, guys. I just thought of this. I had asked that what I thought was a difficult question. Somehow Alan got it like the first time. The true airspeed question. I'll show you the flight computer. I mentioned that the FAA examiner is going to want to test your abilities to use a flight computer. This is not a digital computer. This is not an electronic computer. This is what's called an E6B flight computer. It's a mechanical computer, or affectionately called a whiz wheel in aviation. And with this calculator, this mechanical calculator, you can calculate airspeeds, true airspeed, indicated airspeed, ground speed, fuel consumption, different distance. You can do all sorts of distance calculations. It literally does about like 30 different calculations on the face of this computer. And so my point during the Slack conversation today was that question that I asked can be calculated on the face of this computer. And you may be asked to demonstrate that during a flight test. You know, they'll give you the indicated airspeed and ask for you to calculate the true airspeed, or vice versa. Stuff like that.
When you said analog, I now know what you mean. That's cool. Reminds me of like a slide rule.
It's total slide rule. It's completely. Again, you got a lot of examiners out there that are old school. They would just, you know, if they watched you use this thing, they'd probably pass you right there if they could. You know, that kind of thing.
It's pretty cool when you think about the fact they were able to squeeze mathematics into rotating wheels and sliding rulers. It still amazes me that math works out that cleanly sometimes.
That's nuts. It's completely nuts. It'll drive you crazy trying to learn how to use the thing, but it is actually extremely intuitive when you start using it. It's and maybe we'll find some time. I'll stick some time in one of the sessions to demonstrate a couple calculations, because it's handy to know before you go into your flight training. Be a lot one less thing to learn while you're doing your flying. So yeah, you can get them for $10 on Amazon.
Sounds like a worthy investment just to get familiar with it.
I tell you what, yep. So, all right. Any other thoughts, questions, anything? Are the FAA quizzes, are those helpful? Are those confusing? I mean, I certainly don't cover 110% of the information. You know, some of it comes from the reading, but is there anything that's totally nuts on there that you guys need help with, or?
No, I like them. They definitely point out some weak spots in what I remember or took away from the lesson. So it's good to have those to know where to spend some time.
Okay. Yeah, like I said, I would suggest purchasing a commercially available study guide for the test. I gave a couple examples of ones that I like in an email. Shepherd is really good. Shepherd Air is an iPad app. So yeah, probably when you get close to test time, get I think the Shepherd Air one's like $20 or something like that, 15 or $20. Well worth the investment. Just because the FAA question bank is available and they use it, and the FAA has trick questions, so it's only fair that you get to study them ahead of time. So, alrighty, well,
Cool,
all right,
cool.
sounds good, guys. We are off this Sunday, and we'll reconvene Thursday, a week from today.
Excellent. Safe travels back to Texas.
Yep. Thank you very much. You guys have a good evening. All right.
You too. Thanks.
Yep. See you guys.
Bye, everybody.
Bye bye.